And we are back on the 0 hour. I am Richard RJ Eskow, and now a little break from the world of politics, economics, and social change to talk about the children of the night, to talk about wolves and the songs of wolves. What do they mean? What might they mean? Do they have any relationship to our own various forms of communication, which one would think they do? How does a Russian wolf differ in its song or its howl from a Canadian wolf or a Himalayan wolf? Here to talk to us about that now is a researcher in that area. Holly Root-Gutterridge is a postdoctoral researcher at Syracuse University, where she studies wolves, conservation, and large mammal biology. She is also the author of a recent piece in Aeon, the online magazine, that's AEON, entitled The Songs of the Wolves. Holly, thanks for joining us.
Well, thank you very much for having me.
Well, and by the way, I should add, thank you for writing what was a lovely piece and a great read in Aeon about the Songs of Wolves, which are beautiful to listen to, even if one is, as I now realize, as spectacularly ignorant on the subject as I have been all my life. So I guess I would start with this. What if anything, was your underlying motivation for writing about the Songs of the Wolf to a popular audience, as you did here?
So this originated when we had a paper published recently in the journal Behavioral Processes, where we were discussing the fact that I could hear differences between different wolves when they came from different countries. So in the same way that human beings can have different accents depending on where you've lived and where you've grown up, we found that wolves from Russia sounded quite different to American wolves. We did a paper with Eric Kirschenbaum of Cambridge University as our lead author, and Aeon contacted me after it was published and said, well, would you like to write us a little piece, which sort of mutated into a longer piece, on how we understand what wolves are saying to each other and how we can relate that to human language evolution. Now, I'm a zoologist, so most of what I was writing about was, well, these are my wolves, and this is what I understand, but I guess we could look a little bit at humans as well. And that's how I came about to write the piece. So.
Well, let me start with this question I had for you. By the way, you did a lovely job. Your writing was great on it. Let's start with this, which is, because I know so little about wolves. Big admirer, but don't know much about them. Now, when a human in Russia versus the United States versus another part of the world has a different accent, that is, for lack of a better word, culturally acquired. There's no, as far as I know, physiological difference in the throat structure. So the first question, I guess, would be if a Russian wolf sounds different than a Canadian or a Himalayan, is that structural? Is that physiological, or is it actually a kind of learned difference?
We're not completely sure. We do know that some of the differences are physiological. For instance, a Greek wolf is quite small-bodied, and it's literally a lot smaller than a Russian wolf. So when we were seeing differences in the European Greek wolf and the European Russian wolf, we could say, oh, well, it's because we know they weigh about 30 to 40 pounds less. So the big body was making the Russian wolf howl lower and deeper, in the same way that a big man has a much lower, deeper voice than a small man or a small woman. But they also seem to have some howls that they could all create, so there was no physiological difference between them in being able to create those howls, and then other howl shapes, essentially tunes they were playing that were specific to their subspecies. And what we don't actually know yet is whether that is something they have developed culturally. As far as I know, all of the wolves should be able to make all of these different sounds.
But some make some and some make others, which argues that there is a kind of cultural or at least component to it, as well as physiological, right?
Yes.
So, and that to me, that fascinates and intrigues me. You know, I've read, and I've interviewed a couple of the researchers in the origin of a song and music, human song and music, who's one of the theories, as you probably know, is that human song may have originated in part to establish trust between strangers, that, if a stranger approaches a tribe or a gathering, a settlement where he's not known, that somehow there's more emotion, sincerity conveyed in a song. So in that sense, one might not even think of it as language per se, because it's not a transfer of information so much as it is a communication of an emotional state. And that may be why some people resonate with some kinds of music. Maybe why I love Otis Redding and Dolly Parton and Bob Dylan, who's not supposed to be a good singer. Maybe because I feel a connectedness emotionally that may or may not exist in real life as a result of the way they sing, that they're communicating a trustworthiness or emotional compatibility to me. Is it possible that I'm asking you to speculate wildly, which one should never do to a scientist, but is it possible that there is some non-informational component to wolf song?
Well, they certainly have different howls depending on what they're doing. Fred Harrington, who is one of the great wolf biologists, wrote a paper back in the 80s that talked about differences between wolves that were howling to be aggressive, to say, this is my land, having a much harsher, coarser sound than wolves that were howling to reunite the pack, or when the pack was all together and they were singing before they left for a hunt. So certainly they could be expressing an emotion without needing to have a greater a kind of greater image component to that. It could simply be, here is anger, here is trust being expressed through the song. And I would love to investigate it deeper. It's just very hard with wolves because they are very hard to study in the wild. But what we've seen in captivity is that there is some variation. And it's one of the things we'd like to do next, is to explore how that variation occurs and under what circumstances. So yes, they could be in the same way that Bob Dylan is fantastic at expressing emotion, and his version of Mr. Tambourine Man sounds completely different to the birds. It could be that the wolves themselves can express different things through their howls, and it certainly could be that, especially when they're, say, trying to find a mate, that the howl they use then could be expressing a much more, come to me, I'm here, I'm open, I'm friendly, whereas a howl to say, I've just hunted and killed this animal and it's my dinner, would be much more aggressive.
So that would be the Barry White howl as opposed to the Rob Zombie howl. I'm sorry, I don't mean to be too facetious, but, actually, in fact, I want to bring it back to what drew you to wolf song in the first place? I mean, I think aesthetically it's beautiful. I find it beautiful, but what, were you drawn to it by its beauty or as an intellectual challenge? Both? Something else?
I originally started this with my PhD when I went to Italy before beginning my PhD to learn how to do a lot of wolf biology. And we were standing on an Italian mountaintop the first night I got there, and we howled to the wolves under this big moon. We're using a loudspeaker and a recording of a wolf howl from the local zoo. And all of these wolves howled back to us, including these little puppy wolves that at the time I think were about 2.5 months old.
Oh.
They're very high, piercing little voices. And I asked my friend, okay, well, we can hear them. And he said, okay, tell me how many you hear. Then an argument started because we were like, well, I think it's 3, but you think it's 5, and maybe there's 4 pups, and maybe there's 3. And I thought, well, this is crazy. You spend all this time getting to the top of the mountain to howl, and it's a beautiful night, you can hear the wolves, and then you can't work out how many you're listening to, let alone what they're saying. And I started the PhD to look at some aspects of wolf biology because I love them. They're complex, amazing animals that have these really deep social bonds and social relationships. And there was hardly any papers on wolf howls. And I couldn't believe it. I was thinking, well, surely this is one of the most famous sounds in nature. There must be hundreds of papers. It must be like whale song. No. So that was my PhD, was to investigate what wolves were telling us about themselves by listening to their voices. So that was the beginning of the paper that then, first I looked at individuality, so each wolf has its own unique, distinctive voice, and then I went on to look at other aspects, things like, are there differences between the different subspecies? But I have to admit that a fairly big factor was the fact they're just so beautiful to listen to that the PhD was a pleasure. When I was doing data collection and analysis, I got to go out and stand in the woods and howl at wolves and have them howl back to me. So,
well, lucky you. And so what's next for you, and what's next for the research into the Song of the Wolf? What are the great frontiers to be explored, either for you individually or for the field?
So I'm part of a cooperative predator research group that's looking at using their howls for detecting them in different habitats and seeing if we can track their movements by recording their howls. So that's going on in Yellowstone right now with my colleagues Sarah Waller and Eric Kirschenbaum. We also have a paper that's hopefully going to be submitted very soon about trying to trace the genetic history of Himalayan wolves, or Himalayan wolves, I should say, back to see if they're distinct from Indian wolves, which a very bright student is writing at the moment, Lauren. And in future, I would love to dig more deeply into the behavioral context of the howl. So can we really say, what are the wolves saying to each other? And is an aggressive howl different from a let's go hunting howl? And where do those differences come from? And are they the same? Do you see the same differences, the same kind of basic ideas of language in a Canadian wolf and a Russian wolf, or do they have two completely different ways of saying the same thing?
And do you think they have anything? It all sounds so interesting. Do you think that this has anything to teach us about humanity, or is that a bridge too far? Is that taking it too far?
As I wrote in the Aeon article, one of the problems we have with human language evolution is we couldn't record until the 1860s. So we have to look back at language and trace things. So one thing that not just wolf howls, but animal communication in general can start to teach us is how we may have begun using language and how things may have developed for us all those thousands of years ago when we began. So there's been some great work with birds looking at what we now realize is probably syntax in bird songs. They have grammar as well as just so they can actually change the meaning of what they're calling by the order in which they make the call. So there's something there. And I think also there's always something to be learned from the natural world, just about how close we still are to nature and how many things about ourselves we can see in them.
No, well, that's so well said, and unfortunately, we're going to have to leave it there. But I'm fascinated by the fact that for so many eons, human beings had no language at all either, and perhaps we can learn a little bit about what it meant to be human before there was such a thing as language. So, Holly Root-Gutterridge, researcher into animal behavior and postdoctoral fellow or researcher at Syracuse University, thanks so much for joining us.
Well, thank you very much.